People get inspired to speak up by many things. I got inspired by an Indian comedian. Vir Das gave a short but powerful talk at the Kennedy Centre late last year about the two Indias he came from. One he liked, the other he didn't like so much. I want to talk about the two Australias I come from. One I like a little, and one I don't like at all. I won't be as funny as Vir Das, and I hope I don't get as many death threats as he did. I come from an Australia that makes a sexual assault victim the Australian of the Year. And I come from an Australia that covers up an alleged rape in our national parliament. I come from an Australia where Melbourne for fuck's sake, is voted one of the most livable cities in the world. And while that is true, I also come from an Australia where 10 people in Katherine live in squalor in a 3-bedroom house and no one cares. I come from an Australia that gave the world the 8-hour day, the first right for women to vote and to be elected to Parliament, and to get equal pay for work of equal value. And I come from an Australia that now makes us work longer for less pay, assaults and bullies the women in Parliament, and still pays women less than men for the same work. I come from an Australia that boasts of its 65,000-year-old Indigenous culture, but blows up its religious sites. And I come from an Australia that will not grant that culture a voice from the heart in our foundation document. I come from an Australia that welcomed 60,000 Vietnamese refugees. And yet I come from an Australia that 40 years later imprisons more than 3,000 because they have brown skin and came here in the same leaky boats. I come from an Australia that gives millions upon millions to wealthy religious schools, and yet will not properly fund the public schools or the art faculties of our universities. I come from an Australia where billions upon billions in wealth are reaped from the sale of our gas and coal and iron. And I come from an Australia where government spies bugged an impoverished tiny neighbour so we could get even richer. And I come from an Australia where the government then prosecuted the whistleblowers who told us of that bugging. I come from an Australia where a minister steps down from office for not declaring a toy bear at customs. And I come from an Australia where ministers spend billions of tax dollars to buy votes, and we all just shrug and say they all do it. I come from an Australia that gave us the drum and Four Corners, Kerry O'Brien and Sarah Ferguson. And I come from an Australia that gives us 2GB and the schlock that is Sky News and everything Rupert Murdoch touches. I come from an Australia where Indigenous football heroes are lauded. And I come from an Australia where being ape-like is inferred about one and nobody shuns the man drawing the inference. And Collingwood still has a supporter base. I come from an Australia where a batsman will walk because he knows he nicked it. And I come from an Australia where we cheat at the game and racially sledge those wearing blue or green or maroon. And we accept it as normal. But we criticise the batsman for walking. I come from an Australia where our people come from all the lands on earth, but we do not sing with one voice, and some of us refuse to sing at all. And I come from an Australia with the symbols of the rock, a gifted handful of sand, and a speech in a Sydney slum, unknown by so few and undervalued by so many. I come from an Australia where the government lies about climate change and funds coal-fuelled power stations. And I come from an Australia where nobody cares that they lie about this because everyone knows this government lies about everything. I come from an Australia that will spend billions on tanks and submarines that will never be used except to garner votes and suck up to our allies. And I come from an Australia that will not fund the welfare of its aged care residents during a pandemic that is killing mostly them. I come from an Australia that makes heroes of murderous bushrangers and war criminals. And I come from an Australia that does not protest the persecution of an Australian whistleblower by our treaty allies. I come from an Australia where our Prime Minister is a man of strong faith who is good friends with another man of strong faith, a man who even Trump would not allow to visit the White House. I come from an Australia where our youngest ever High Court judge helped write the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I come from an Australia that bans the Eureka flag on building sites, but allows the swastika to be displayed anywhere. I come from an Australia where our Prime Ministers can publicly cry and not be thought weak. And I come from an Australia where our politicians' hardness of heart towards others makes us cry. I come from an Australia where our poor laws condemn someone to live on $40 a day, and I come from an Australia where our politicians get 9 times more for having to endure the discomfort of the combat zone that is Canberra. I come from an Australia that is so smart it invented the bionic ear, Wi-Fi, polymer banknotes, the black box fight recorder, and Google Maps. And I come from an Australia that is so dumb we think being called the lucky country was a compliment. And we chose this coterie of thieves, spivs and climate-denying corporate lickspittles to be our government for so many years. Which of these Australias do I value? One of them. Which of them values me? None of them. Except when it comes time to vote. Then they will shower me with promises of riches, but only if I live in a marginal electorate. Which Australia will I vote for? One of them. Reluctantly, because I have to, and because policy light is better than a policy of riches for some and pennies for the rest. In which Australia do you want to live? Think about that. And when you go into that polling booth and pick up that pencil, make some noise for the Australia you want to live in.